Welcome, dear friends. Tonight we journey together to St. Mary Mead, where December snow lies soft across the cottages like sugared cakes. Inside, fires glow and pine scents drift through warm rooms as the village prepares for Christmas. Settle in with tea or cocoa. Where are you listening from tonight? On Christmas Eve, children's laughter rang through the village square as they rolled great balls of snow into proud snowmen. Their joy carried into the night air, until one small voice cut sharply across the merriment. Near the church gate, the snow was marred by a dark stain. At first the villagers thought of spilt wine, perhaps dropped from a careless hand, but as they drew closer, the truth revealed itself. Against the untouched whiteness lay a splash of red, blood, stark and chilling. Yet no body was found, no tracks in the snow, only whispers rising beneath the Christmas bells. Chapter 1. Snowfall and Secrets. The morning after the strange discovery, the village awoke beneath a sky the color of pearl. Frost clung to hedgerows and window panes, while smoke curled lazily from chimney-pots. St. Mary Mead seemed, at first glance, the picture of seasonal contentment. Children dashed about with cheeks pink from cold, their boots crunching over packed snow. Housewives hurried along the lanes with baskets on their arms, wrapped in scarves, exchanging polite greetings as they made their way to the grocer for last-minute purchases. The smell of baking bread drifted faintly through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of pine and wood smoke. Inside the shops, there was a sense of lively bustle. At the greengrocer's, baskets of apples and oranges gleamed like jewels against the frosty morning light, while strings of cranberries hung in cheerful loops across the window. At the butcher's, customers queued in good spirits, discussing turkeys, mince pies, and plum puddings, their chatter overlapping with talk of the carol service. Yet beneath the hum of festivity, a ripple of unease moved quietly, almost too faint to notice, like a draught through a warm room. Miss Marple, wrapped in her tweed coat and a sensible hat, moved quietly among the villagers. She paused at the post office to collect her letters, offering a gentle smile to Mrs. Hartley, who stood behind the counter. Her keen eyes, however, observed far more than her words revealed. She noted the way Mrs. Hartley's hands trembled slightly as she stamped envelopes, and how her gaze flickered toward the church when she thought no one was looking. Walking through the square, Miss Marple stopped to admire the children's snowmen, now slightly lopsided after a night's frost. The youngsters laughed, chasing one another with handfuls of powdery snow, but the adults lingering nearby seemed distracted. Mr. Abbott, the blacksmith, normally full of booming cheer, spoke in a low voice to the innkeeper. Their conversation broke off sharply when others drew near, replaced by forced smiles and hearty talk of decorations. At the edge of the square, a group of women adjusted wreaths of holly and ivy around the church door. Their hands were busy, but their eyes shifted constantly toward the gate, where the curious stain had been found the night before. The snow had drifted over it by now, hiding the unsettling mark, but the memory remained vivid. They whispered amongst themselves, their voices soft but urgent, until the vicar approached, urging them kindly to focus on their preparations. Even then, a shadow of unease lingered. Miss Marple continued her stroll, stopping at the baker's window where sugared cakes glistened invitingly. A cheerful greeting was offered by Mr. Sims, the baker, yet his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. He looked over his shoulder more than once, as if fearing an unexpected visitor. Miss Marple thanked him politely for the fresh rolls he pressed into her hands, though her mind turned quietly upon the tension she observed in nearly every face. As the church bells rang noon, villagers bustled homeward, each clutching packages, ribbons, and small treasures for the holiday. The air should have been filled with nothing more than anticipation, yet instead it held a peculiar weight. Something unspoken hung over St. Mary Mead, as present as the snow beneath their boots. Miss Marple, pausing at her garden gate, cast one final glance toward the church. She noticed, with that sharp intuition so often hidden beneath her mild manner, how neighbors avoided one another's eyes, and how their steps quickened when passing the gate. The village was wrapped in frost and festive garlands, yet behind the glow of Christmas cheer lay secrets waiting to surface. The stain by the church gate had not faded from memory, even though the night snow had softened its sharp edges. By morning, the tale had spread through every cottage, shop, and lane of St. Mary Mead. What had been only whispers beneath the lamplight now became full-bodied speculation, shared in hurried voices as villagers met over hedges or paused on the cobbled path. Some said it was nothing more than a trick of shadow, others swore the red gleam against the white could not be mistaken. Few dared to name it outright, but all knew what it must be: blood, stark and chilling against the Christmas snow. The churchyard, ordinarily so peaceful, became the focus of curious footsteps. One by one, villagers drifted toward the gate, drawn as though by invisible threads. They stood in little clusters, coats pulled tightly against the cold, pointing toward the spot where the mark had been found. Some insisted they could still see a faint tinge beneath the new fall of snow, while others shook their heads, claiming the children had exaggerated. But the hushed tone of their voices betrayed unease. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a keen taste for drama, leaned heavily upon her umbrella as she declared to anyone who would listen that she had seen a strange figure loitering by the church the evening before. A tall man, she insisted, wrapped in a dark coat with his hat pulled low. When pressed for details, her story grew more uncertain, yet the image had already planted itself in eager minds. Soon the village was alive with the notion of an unknown visitor, skulking beneath the shadows of the holly trees. Mr. Abbott, the blacksmith, scoffed at such tales. He claimed it was nothing more than a dropped bottle from the Christmas revelers at the inn. Yet his wife quickly hushed him, glancing around with nervous eyes, as though fearing that even such dismissal might invite misfortune. Others wondered aloud if the blood belonged to an injured animal. But no carcass had been found, and the thought of some beast wandering wounded through the village brought little comfort. Through it all, Miss Marple remained by the churchyard wall, her expression mild, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. She listened without interruption as stories collided and swirled like snowflakes in the wind. She observed how some faces grew pale at the mention of blood, how others brightened with the excitement of gossip, and how a few exchanged guarded looks, quickly averted when noticed. The vicar arrived at last, his breath misting in the cold air, his voice measured as he urged the gathering to disperse. "There is no cause for alarm," he said gently, though his eyes betrayed weariness. He insisted the matter was being seen to, though he offered no explanation of how or by whom. The villagers obeyed reluctantly, their footsteps crunching away, yet their conversations carried on, spilling from house to house, from hearth to hearth. That evening, lights burned late across St. Mary Mead. Curtains twitched as neighbors peered out into the snowy dark, half expecting to see that shadowy figure Mrs. Price had described. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into theories, and theories into certainties. Yet there remained no body, no trail, not even a clue beyond that sinister mark in the snow. Miss Marple, seated by her fire with her knitting needles clicking softly, turned over the matter in her quiet mind. She knew the village well, its rhythms, its habits, its silences. And she knew, too, that such a disturbance would not pass without leaving its trace. Somewhere in the quiet unease of her neighbors lay the key, and though she said nothing, her sharp eyes missed little. The stain by the gate lingered not just on the snow, but in the thoughts of every soul in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parlor. The following afternoon, the village seemed quieter, as if the snow itself had muffled the usual cheer. Yet behind closed doors, the murmur of voices carried. At the Rose and Crown Inn, where the fire burned cheerfully in the hearth and the scent of scones filled the air, a small group gathered for tea. It was the sort of gathering where gossip flowed as easily as the steam from the teapot, and every word seemed to circle back to the same subject, the blood in the snow. Mrs. Price was, of course, in attendance. She perched at the edge of her chair, her umbrella leaning nearby, her eyes bright with the thrill of having something to share. She repeated, for what must have been the third time, her account of the shadowy figure she had seen. "A tall man, I tell you, tall and wrapped in a dark coat," she insisted, tapping the table for emphasis. "You can laugh if you like, but I know what I saw." Across from her, Mr. Sims the baker shook his head slowly, dust still clinging to his sleeves from the morning's work. "I'd say it was more likely spilled wine from the inn," he remarked, though his tone lacked conviction. His eyes kept darting toward the door, as though he expected someone to walk in and prove him wrong. Mrs. Abbott, sitting with perfect posture, poured tea with a steady hand, but her lips were pressed tightly together. "Wine does not leave such a mark," she said at last, her voice clipped. "And there were no bottles left nearby. It was blood, and we all know it." She offered no further comment, but the firm way she set the teapot down suggested she had seen more than she cared to say. Miss Hartley, the postmistress, leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I heard," she began, eyes flicking to the door, "that someone from the manor was expected in the village that evening. A guest who never arrived." The words hung in the air, met with raised brows and quickened whispers. The manor, grand, imposing, and full of long histories, was always fertile ground for speculation. Mrs. Price clasped her hands together, clearly delighted to have her tale supported by something new. "Aha! Then it may have been him, the tall man I saw. Perhaps he never reached the house at all." She sat back with a satisfied smile, though her eyes gleamed with curiosity more than certainty. Mr. Sims shifted in his chair. "If it were a guest," he said slowly, "why has nothing been said? You'd think the master of the house would be turning the village upside down." He broke a scone in half and buttered it absent-mindedly, though he hardly seemed hungry. Mrs. Abbott gave a quiet sigh. "Perhaps there are matters best kept private." Her words, though softly spoken, carried weight. Everyone at the table glanced at her, waiting for more, but she simply raised her teacup and sipped, her eyes betraying nothing. Through it all, Miss Marple sat at the corner of the table, her knitting bag resting by her side. She contributed little to the conversation, save for a polite nod here, a gentle indeed there. Yet her sharp eyes moved from face to face, noting not only what was said, but what was left unspoken. She saw the way Mrs. Abbott's fingers tightened on her teacup when the manor was mentioned, the way Mr. Sims avoided Mrs. Price's gaze, and the slight tremor in Miss Hartley's voice when she spoke of the missing guest. The fire crackled, the tea flowed, and the scones disappeared one by one. To a stranger, it might have looked like nothing more than a pleasant gathering of neighbors. But beneath the warmth of the inn, every word carried a hint of tension, every glance concealed more than it revealed. Each villager seemed to guard a private corner of themselves, a small secret tucked away like a letter in a locked drawer. By the time the teapot was empty, the group had convinced themselves of half a dozen possible explanations, none of which settled the matter. As the company dispersed, wrapping themselves tightly against the chill outside, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the fire. Her eyes followed the last swirl of steam rising from the teacups, as though it might reveal the truth no one dared to voice. In St. Mary Mead, even over tea and scones, everyone had something to hide. By the next day, the whispers that had begun over tea at the inn had spread like ivy across every cottage and lane. St. Mary Mead had always thrived on gentle gossip, who baked the best pies, whose roses had taken a prize at the fete, but this was different. The talk carried an edge, sharpened by the strange unease of the stain in the snow. And now there was a new thread to the tale, the missing guest from the manor. The manor house, standing proudly at the edge of the village, had long been a source of curiosity. Its high windows glowed at night, but what passed within its grand rooms was often unknown to the common villager. When the suggestion arose that someone expected there on Christmas Eve had failed to appear, interest rose at once. Who was this mysterious visitor, and why had their absence gone unmentioned until now? Miss Hartley, the postmistress, was said to have overheard part of it first. A letter, she claimed, had been sent weeks earlier, speaking of an arrival just before Christmas, a cousin or acquaintance, though the details were murky. When asked for more, she pursed her lips and said she had spoken too much already. But in the way of such things, that hint was enough. Soon half the village repeated it as fact. Mrs. Price, delighted to have further ground for her story of the tall man by the gate, repeated her vision with renewed confidence. "It was him, of course it was him," she insisted to anyone who would pause to listen. "He must have been waylaid, poor soul, before he ever reached the house. Why else would he not arrive?" At the smithy, Mr. Abbott argued that perhaps there had been no guest at all. "Folk imagine these things," he declared, wiping his brow with a sooty cloth. Yet his wife exchanged a meaningful look with her neighbor, suggesting she thought otherwise. At the grocer's counter, two women whispered over their baskets, convinced that the missing guest was tied to old grievances within the family that owned the manor. "You know how it is with kin," one said knowingly. "Trouble always finds its way to the hearth." All the while, Miss Marple listened in her usual quiet fashion. She heard the tales twist and grow, each retelling shaping the story anew. One claimed the guest had come from London, another that he was a naval officer returning after years abroad. Some even whispered of inheritance and money left dangling, threads that always drew eager fingers. Yet the fact remained, no visitor had knocked at the manor's door. No carriage had been seen on the frosty road, no suitcase carried up the steps. It was as though the guest had melted away into the very snow. And there, just outside the church gate, had been that dreadful mark. By evening, the matter had become the chief topic by every fire. Was it coincidence that a guest had failed to appear, or was it fate that linked his absence to the blood on the snow? Mothers pulled their children closer as they spoke of it. Men lingered longer at the inn, discussing theories until the candles burned low. Every possibility seemed both too simple and too strange, and no answer satisfied. Miss Marple, seated by her own hearth with her knitting needles glinting softly in the firelight, considered the matter more deeply. She knew the ways of villages, how secrets wrapped themselves in polite words, and how truth often slipped out only in fragments. A missing guest was not, in itself, unusual. Trains were delayed, letters went astray. But blood outside the church was another matter entirely. To her mind, the two could not be so easily separated. As the church bells tolled the hour and the snow continued to fall, the question lingered like smoke in the air. What had become of the missing guest, and why had Christmas in St. Mary Mead begun with blood upon the snow? Chapter 3. Candles and Shadows. The village church glowed with warmth against the icy December night, its tall windows lit by dozens of flickering candles. Snow crunched softly beneath the boots of those gathering for the Christmas Eve service, their breath clouding in the frozen air. Inside, the air carried the mingled scent of pine boughs and beeswax, and the hush of reverence spread as people slipped into pews. For a moment, the world outside, the stain by the gate, the missing guest, the restless speculation, seemed to fade. This was Christmas in St. Mary Mead, and tradition held a comforting strength. The choir began with familiar carols, their voices rising like pure silver in the vaulted space. Children fidgeted beside their mothers. Old Mr. Larkin sang with gusto, if not with perfect pitch, and the vicar offered gentle smiles as he prepared his sermon. The village, gathered together in harmony, appeared a picture of peace. Yet for one who knew how to look, that peace was only the surface. Miss Marple, sitting quietly toward the side, let her eyes wander from face to face as the hymn swelled. She noticed the way Mrs. Price clutched her prayer book tighter than usual, her lips moving but her eyes wandering toward the great oak door. Mr. Abbott's wife leaned close to whisper something during the singing, her expression not one of devotion but of worry. Even the vicar, steady as he was, glanced once or twice toward the shadows near the back, as though half expecting someone who never came. The candles burned brightly, casting both warmth and deep pockets of shadow across the stone walls. Light and darkness seemed to play together that night, and in that playfulness Miss Marple found something unsettling. The villagers sang, but their minds were not entirely upon their hymnals. There were glances exchanged, quiet words slipped between verses, nervous adjustments of gloves and scarves. A community that usually sang as one seemed, in some subtle way, divided. After the choir finished, "O come, all ye faithful," the vicar rose to speak. His words were gentle, reminding everyone of hope and goodwill, of the joy found in kindness to neighbors. Yet even as he spoke of unity, Miss Marple observed small betrayals in the congregation. Mrs. Hartley, the postmistress, lowered her eyes quickly when a name was mentioned in prayer, a name tied to someone who had left the village long ago under circumstances not often discussed. The moment was small, fleeting, but telling, and Miss Marple tucked it away. For in her experience, the past had a way of returning, even on the holiest of nights. The service continued, the carols rising again. This time, Miss Marple noticed a different tension, an eagerness for the end. People shifted more than usual, some looking toward the door, as if anxious to step back into the night. When the final hymn was sung, the congregation moved briskly, too briskly, into the snowy square. The festive air was strained, though outwardly cheerful words were exchanged. "Lovely service," said one. "Beautiful singing," replied another. But the eyes, Miss Marple saw, told a quieter truth. As the last of the villagers left, the church fell into silence, candles guttering low. Miss Marple lingered, as she often did, her sharp gaze resting once more on the shadowed corner where a pew sat slightly out of place. Someone had risen too quickly, perhaps startled, leaving it uneven with the rest. Such details, overlooked by most, never escaped her. She drew her shawl more closely around her shoulders and stepped into the frosty air, carrying not just the music of the night, but the weight of its secrets. In the distance, the manor windows glowed faintly, a reminder of the missing guest. And in the stillness, she thought again of the blood by the gate, and the way unease had lingered even through the carols. Peace on earth, yes, but in St. Mary Mead, shadows moved quietly alongside the light. Snowflakes drifted steadily from the night sky, settling like lace over the rooftops as villagers returned from the carol service. Lanterns flickered in windows, doors closed against the chill, and smoke curled in soft ribbons above chimneys. The square, which only hours earlier had been filled with children's laughter and anxious whispers, was nearly deserted. Nearly, save for one figure who stood near the inn, brushing snow from a dark coat and looking about with careful eyes. It was not often that strangers arrived in St. Mary Mead unannounced, especially on Christmas Eve. The man was tall, his features weathered by travel, with a certain city sharpness that set him apart from the rustic familiarity of the village. His boots bore the crust of snow for many miles, and though he carried himself with quiet confidence, there was the faint air of unease about him, the look of someone stepping into unknown territory. By the following morning, word had spread as quickly as fire in dry straw. Over breakfast tables and in warm kitchens, villagers exchanged the same question. Who was he? At the grocer's, Mrs. Price insisted he must be a tradesman, though no goods accompanied him. Mrs. Hartley at the post office countered that he had asked, quite directly, for directions to the vicarage. But before noon, it was revealed by Mrs. Finch, whose daughter worked at the inn, that the man had given a name, one tied firmly to St. Mary Mead. He claimed relation to none other than the Abbott family, long established in the village. Such a claim could not help but stir curiosity. The Abbotts had lived in the manor for generations, their history woven deep into the fabric of the community. Yet the family was small now, reduced to Mr. Abbott, his wife, and their grown son who lived abroad. What cousin, what distant nephew, might arrive without warning, just as whispers of a missing guest and blood in the snow lingered over the parish? That evening, the inn's parlor brimmed with gossip. Villagers leaned close over their glasses of mulled wine, voices dropping low so as not to be overheard, though their eyes shone with excitement. "He said his mother was an abbot," one man recounted, "but I never recall hearing of her." "Inheritance," whispered another, "always comes to it in the end." It was a word that made hearts beat a little faster, for where money and property lay, so too did motives. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting on her lap, listened with the same mild attention she had given to countless such conversations. She rarely contributed, save for a soft "indeed," or "how curious," but she caught the details others missed. The stranger had asked not only after the abbots, but also, according to Mrs. Finch's daughter, about the guest who had been expected at the manor. An odd coincidence, or not one at all. Later that night, a knock sounded at the vicarage door. The vicar, surprised, opened it to find a man standing there, hat in hand, snow clinging to his shoulders. His manner was polite, even deferential, but his eyes carried a searching sharpness. "I believe," he said, "that I may be among family here." The vicar welcomed him in, offering warmth and a chair by the fire, yet even as they spoke, he felt a subtle unease creep over him. For in villages such as St. Mary Mead, strangers never arrived without purpose. And though the man's smile was courteous, the question on everyone's lips lingered like the echo of the church bells. Was he truly kin, or something else entirely? Miss Marple, passing the vicarage window on her evening walk, saw the silhouette within and paused. Her eyes narrowed just slightly as the snow gathered at her feet. The threads of mystery were tightening, and she knew from long experience that a newcomer was rarely just what he seemed. Chapter 4. A Locked Cottage. The lane beyond the church curved gently past hedgerows heavy with snow, their branches bowed like weary shoulders under white weight. It was a quiet corner of St. Mary Mead, often bypassed by villagers hurrying toward the square or the manor. Yet Miss Marple, who enjoyed her daily walks in all seasons, took note of every little detail in such overlooked places. And so, as she strolled with careful steps along the frosted path, her eyes fell once more upon the cottage that always seemed to be holding its breath. It was a modest place, tucked back from the road, with ivy clinging stubbornly even in winter. But what drew attention, if one was inclined to notice, were the windows. Frost veiled them as it did all glass in the village this time of year, yet these panes never cleared. The curtains inside, heavy and dark, were drawn tight from morning to night. No glow of candle ever showed through, no shadow moved across the fabric, no smoke curled from the chimney. It was a house that, in the midst of festive bustle, seemed curiously lifeless. Villagers spoke little of it. They might pass by with quickened step, remarking vaguely that no one lived there now, though no one could quite say who last had. Others murmured that it belonged to cousins of the Abbot family, seldom visiting, content to let it stand shuttered through the seasons. Yet as Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, brushing a dusting of snow from her sleeve, she thought it odd. For cottages, like people, left traces of their lives, footprints to and fro, a milk bottle left, the faint warmth of occupancy. Here there was nothing. She did not linger long, not wishing to be seen staring too obviously. Instead she continued down the lane, her mind quietly turning. A locked cottage, in itself, was no crime. Yet when set against the stain of blood in the snow, a missing guest, and the arrival of a stranger with claims of kinship, its silence began to feel louder. In mysteries of village life, it was often the quietest places that held the sharpest secrets. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting by the fire, the flames painting flickers across her thoughtful face. She recalled a time, years ago, when another shuttered house had concealed an unhappy story, one that had unraveled only through noticing the simplest of details, the kind everyone else overlooked. Was this the same? Perhaps nothing at all, and yet the way the villagers avoided speaking of the cottage gave it weight. Secrets, she knew, could cling to walls just as ivy clung to stone. The next morning brought clear skies and a brittle cold, the sort that made snow sparkle like glass. Miss Marple again walked her circuit, this time noting a small thing, just at the edge of the cottage path, where the frost lay smooth, the faintest mark of a boot heel. Not fresh, no, but not weeks old either. Someone had been there, though none admitted it. Later, over tea at Mrs. Price's, Miss Marple let the conversation drift to properties in the village. "It must be difficult," she mused lightly, "keeping up a house one does not live in. I dare say someone must check on it, even now and then." Mrs. Price hesitated just long enough before replying, "Oh, I shouldn't think so. No one's been near that cottage for years." But the quick glance she gave her daughter suggested otherwise, and Miss Marple tucked the glance away like a clue in her knitting bag. There are houses, she thought, that stand open to the world, their windows welcoming, their fires burning. And there are houses that guard their secrets behind frosted panes. It is the unseen that pricks at one's mind, the silence that feels heavier than sound. And in St. Mary Mead that winter, the locked cottage was as eloquent as any villager's gossip. The next morning, the village stirred under another fall of snow, the rooftops glistening as though dusted with sugar. Inside cottages, kettles hissed and teapots steamed, the ordinary comforts of life unfolding as they always did. Yet in such ordinary details, Miss Marple often found the threads that others missed. And it was over something as small as a broken teacup that her sharp eye caught the first real crack in a carefully told story. It began at Mrs. Hartley's, the postmistress, who had invited Miss Marple in for tea after the morning errands. The table was laid neatly, as always, with her best china set upon a lace cloth. A plate of currant buns sat waiting, their sugar tops glistening in the weak winter light. As they sat down, Mrs. Hartley began recounting, as many had, where she had been on Christmas Eve. She insisted she had spent the entire evening at home, mending accounts and preparing the church collection envelopes. "Not a foot outside my door," she said firmly, her tone brisk, as though to push away any doubt. Miss Marple listened politely, nodding, sipping at her tea. Her attention, however, drifted to the cup she held. It was from a familiar set, delicate porcelain with painted violets along the rim. Miss Marple knew it well, for she had seen it many times before, always displayed with pride. Yet this cup bore a thin crack, hastily glued, the mend visible if one looked closely. And that was curious, for Miss Marple distinctly remembered hearing Mrs. Hartley complain only last week that she had lost a cup from the set. "Dropped it and shattered to bits," she had said. "Irreplaceable, and such a pity." Now here was the same cup, cracked but intact, pressed into use at her tea-table. A simple inconsistency, perhaps, but one that clinked oddly against the woman's tale of not stepping outside her door. For how could a cup, thought to be ruined, suddenly return whole, unless it had never been broken at all, or had been broken somewhere else, in circumstances Mrs. Hartley preferred not to explain? As the conversation continued, Miss Marple asked, in her mildest tone, "And you spent all evening at home? Not even a visitor to break the monotony?" Mrs. Hartley shook her head quickly, too quickly. "No visitors at all. Quiet as the grave." The denial carried the sharpness of someone rehearsing their answer. And when Miss Marple's eyes flicked once more to the mended cup, she saw the faintest flush creep across the postmistress's cheek. Later that afternoon, over wool skeins at the shop, Mrs. Price let slip that she had seen a lantern burning in Mrs. Hartley's window at an unusually late hour. "Near midnight, I'd say," she remarked. "Odd that. She's usually abed by 10. Another thread, another small sign that the tale did not quite hold together. Miss Marple knew better than to draw conclusions too soon. A broken teacup, after all, might mean nothing more than clumsiness. But in her long years of observing human nature, she had learned that it is often in the little domestic things, what people eat, what they mend, what they forget they once said, that the truth peeks through. Lies are rarely consistent in their details. And this one, though wrapped in lace cloths and poured into violet-painted china, was already beginning to fray. She sipped her tea slowly, as if savoring it, while her mind worked as neatly as her knitting needles. A villager's alibi was shaken, not shattered, not yet, but cracked along a thin line. And in the world of mysteries, a crack is all that is needed for the light of truth to find its way in. Chapter 5. The Silent Witness. The night snowfall had laid a new, glistening blanket over St. Mary Mead, smoothing away the muddled paths and trampled squares of the previous days. By morning, the world looked untouched, pure, silent, and glittering beneath the pale sun. To most villagers, it was a scene of beauty, worthy of admiration before fires were stoked and kettles boiled. But to Miss Marple, snow was never just decoration. Snow was a keeper of records, a witness to movements no eye had seen. It was in the Abbot orchard, just beyond the stone wall that separated the manor grounds from the lane, that she noticed them. She had paused, as she often did, to admire the trees, bare branches tipped with white, the ground below shimmering like glass. And there, breaking the surface of untouched snow, were footprints. Not many, only a short sequence, but clear enough, the deep impressions of boots, pressed firmly as if in haste. What was strange was not their presence, but their disappearance. They began near the wall, as though someone had climbed over from the lane, and they carried on a dozen steps into the orchard. Then, quite suddenly, they stopped. No return prints, no winding path leading elsewhere, simply a vanishing. The snow beyond lay flawless, unbroken in any direction. Miss Marple leaned upon her stick, her sharp eyes narrowing. She measured the stride, noted the weight pressed into each heel. A man's steps, most likely, though not so heavy as to suggest great strength. But where had he gone? The orchard was open, no trees thick enough to conceal him, no shed or stable near enough to reach without leaving some mark. And yet, as if the snow itself had swallowed him, he was gone. Later, she heard villagers talking. Mrs. Price claimed to have seen lantern light flickering in that same orchard late the previous night. "Like will-o'-the-wisps," she whispered, crossing herself. Others laughed it off, saying snow and moonlight played tricks on tired eyes. But Miss Marple knew that where there were lights, there was someone to carry them. And the footprints, vanishing into silence, bore quiet testimony that something or someone had indeed passed that way. She mentioned it lightly over tea with the vicar, describing the tracks as one might describe a curious flower seen in bloom. He frowned, thoughtful, his hands folded. "The orchard has not been tended in years," he said. No reason for anyone to go there now. Miss Marple smiled gently. Unless they had a reason not to be seen. That night, she found herself thinking again of the missing guest, of the stranger who claimed kinship, and of the locked cottage with its shuttered windows. The orchard seemed a thread that tied them all together, though the knot was not yet clear. Who had walked there, and why had the trail ended in such mystery? Snow, she knew, was honest. It recorded truth without bias, preserving it until melted by sun or disturbed by other feet. But it was also fragile. A gust of wind, another flurry, and the evidence would vanish. Whoever had left those tracks might already be counting on that, secure in the thought that Snow could not speak. Yet Miss Marple had seen, and in her mind the picture was already etched. Footprints that led into nowhere rarely meant nothing, and in her long experience, the quietest of witnesses, the faintest of traces, often held the loudest truths. It was a bitterly cold afternoon, the kind that drove most villagers indoors to the comfort of fires and steaming kettles. Windows glowed softly against the falling snow, and the square was nearly deserted save for the crunch of a milkman's cart. Inside Mrs. Price's cottage, however, the hearth crackled merrily, and her tabby cat, Jasper, stretched himself in a patch of warmth as though he owned the very room. Cats, after all, were silent observers, moving in and out of places unnoticed, and sometimes bringing home things no one else would dare touch. Miss Marple had stopped by to return a borrowed pattern book. She stood in the tidy sitting-room, knitting bag looped over her arm, when the door creaked open and Jasper padded in, tail held high. At first, no one noticed. But then Mrs. Price gave a startled cry. "Oh, heavens, what's he got now?" she exclaimed, reaching down as Jasper dropped his prize at her feet. It was not a mouse, nor a twig, nor any harmless trophy from the garden. It was a shred of cloth, torn and muddied at the edges. And worse, dark stains marred its center, stains unmistakably red, dried but still grim in the firelight. Mrs. Price recoiled, pressing a hand to her mouth. Where could he have found such a thing? Miss Marple bent with care, her eyes narrowing as she studied the scrap. The fabric was of good quality, finely woven wool, the sort used in coats rather than rags. It was not long, no more than a hand span, but enough to tell a story. The edges were frayed as if torn in haste, and the blood upon it was not fresh, though recent enough to hold its color. "Cats are curious creatures," Miss Marple said gently, her voice calm though her mind was keen. "They wander where we do not, and fetch back what they should not." She picked up the piece carefully, noting its texture. Not the coarse work of laborers' clothes, nor the bright cotton of children's scarves. This was a darker, heavier cloth, sober and practical. A man's garment, most likely. Mrs. Price fretted, wringing her hands. Oh, it must have been from the refuse heap, or caught on a hedge. Cats will drag home anything. But her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes flicked nervously toward the shuttered window. Jasper, satisfied with his offering, curled back into the warmth of the hearth, licking his paws as though nothing at all were amiss. But Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully, recalling the orchard tracks that led into nowhere, the locked cottage with its unlit windows, and the blood in the snow by the church gate. A cat had no reason to invent or deceive. His gift, unpleasant though it was, held weight. She slipped the cloth into her knitting bag, murmuring about having it cleaned, though her intention was quite the opposite. To dismiss it as rubbish would be easy, but to ignore it would be folly. In her long years she had seen chance discoveries, an overheard word, a misplaced glove, a child's remark, proved decisive. Why not a cat's offering? As she left the cottage, the snow fell harder, muting the village in silence. Lights glowed faintly through frosted glass, and chimneys smoked against the darkening sky. Yet in Miss Marple's mind, the warmth of hearths seemed dimmed by the thought of bloodied cloth carried in a pet's mouth. Some secrets could be hidden behind shutters and words, but others had a way of finding their way home, like a cat at evening, carrying truth in its teeth. Chapter 6. The Past Returns. The fire burned low in Miss Marple's sitting-room, the flames glowing like embers of memory. Outside, snow whispered against the window-panes, soft as lace. She sat with her knitting needles clicking gently, but her thoughts were not upon the wool. Instead, they wandered back through the years, to a time when St. Mary Mead had been younger, yet no less filled with secrets. For beneath the charm of any village, she knew, the past never quite lay buried. And tonight, as the mystery deepened, an old scandal stirred again in her mind, one that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the present. She remembered it clearly, a summer more than 3 decades ago, when the roses bloomed heavy against cottage walls and tempers ran high beneath the warmth. At the heart of it had been Mr. Abbott's late uncle, a man of wealth and pride who had brought a new bride into the village. She was young, striking, and possessed of a spirit that did not suit St. Mary Mead's quieter ways. Whispers began soon enough, her laughter with another man, her absence from home at peculiar hours. And then, one morning, she was gone. The official story was that she had returned to her family in the north, weary of village life. But Miss Marple, even then younger and not quite so gray, had watched the expressions of neighbors and had seen too much unease in the eyes of her husband. The young woman's trunks had not gone with her. Her jewelry was never collected. And, curiously enough, a laborer from the manor lands also disappeared within the same fortnight, a fellow of good looks but poor prospects. No bodies were ever found, no charges ever laid. The village returned to its rhythm, but the air held a faint bitterness long after the roses had dropped their petals. Now, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, she thought again of the locked cottage with its shuttered windows, the orchard footprints that ended in silence, and the stranger who had come claiming blood ties to the Abbotts. Secrets, she knew, had long roots, and often what seemed like a fresh mystery was merely an old-wound reopening. At the post office, she had seen Mrs. Hartley grow stiff at the mention of certain names tied to that long-ago scandal. And when the bloodied scrap of cloth appeared by way of Jasper the cat, Miss Marple could not help but recall the rumors that the vanished bride had been fond of wearing a dark woolen coat of fine quality, the very sort this fragment might have belonged to. Could it be mere coincidence, a memory mistaken? Or had some trace of that old story been stirred from its hiding-place, like dust shaken from a rug? The thought unsettled her, for time had a way of reshaping truth, yet never erasing it. Villagers grew old, but their silences often spoke louder than their words. She had noticed, during the carol service, the vicar's hesitation when he prayed for departed souls, how his gaze had flicked, almost unwillingly, toward the manor pew. Such a glance might mean nothing, but to Miss Marple it was one more pebble on the scale. She folded her knitting into her lap and gazed into the fire. Human nature, she reflected, never changed, whether in youth or old age. Jealousy, pride, ambition, love, they drove people to folly as surely now as they had 30 years before. And when the same patterns reappeared, it was often because the past had not finished its tale. Outside, the snow deepened, laying a white cover over gardens and lanes, as though to hide all stains beneath its purity. But Miss Marple knew better. Snow could conceal, yes, but it could not cleanse. The truth of that vanished summer still lingered, and perhaps, just perhaps, it had returned now in the form of the stranger at the inn, the blood in the snow, and the locked cottage with its secrets. The parlor of the vicarage was dim, the only light a faint glow from the hearth where the last coals smouldered. It was Mrs. Weatherby, ever fussy with dusters and pokers, who noticed something curious. As she bent to tidy the grate, her sharp eyes caught a slip of paper half buried in the ashes. Most of it was charred and curling at the edges, but a corner remained intact, enough to show that this had once been more than ordinary kindling. "Dear heavens!" she muttered, plucking it out with the tongs before the flames consumed the last of it. The ink had run, but words still shone through. "Cannot delay further. They will suspect. Meet me by—" The rest was lost to the fire's appetite. When Miss Marple was quietly shown the scrap later that evening, she studied it with keen attention. Her eyes, soft and blue behind her spectacles, missed nothing. A letter, half-burned, suggested panic. And panic meant guilt. For why else would anyone thrust such a note into the fire unless they feared what it revealed? The villagers had gathered in low whispers. Mr. Pritchard from the grocer's leaned heavily on his stick, muttering about young people and their reckless romances. Mrs. Hartley, pale as milk, fanned herself though the room was cold, and the vicar, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, tried to insist that many letters passed through St. Mary Mead this time of year. Christmas greetings, accounts to settle, news from cousins abroad. But Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently in her lap as she listened. Christmas greetings seldom contained such words as "suspect" or "cannot delay further." The half-letter carried a peculiar intimacy, the kind that spoke of secrets shared in haste. And then there was the question of its origin. Who had thrown it into the fire, and why here, in the vicarage hearth? The vicar was a kind man, but not without his blind spots. His household, too, had its visitors, parishioners, choir members, charity collectors, any one of whom might have stolen a private moment beside the flames. The missing guest, the one expected at the manor but never arrived, loomed large in every villager's thoughts. What if this letter had been theirs? A final desperate attempt to arrange a meeting, cut short by silence? Perhaps the writer had meant to explain a delay, or to confess something more dangerous. And if they had written it, who in the village had been its intended recipient? The fragment was passed around the room once more. "Meet me by—" it ended. By what? The gate, the orchard, the lane by the church? The possibilities stirred unease, each place now feeling charged with menace. Mrs. Hartley dropped the fragment suddenly as though it burned her fingers. "It might be nothing," she said too quickly. "Old scraps, old letters. We mustn't jump to conclusions." But her eyes flickered toward Mr. Abbot, who sat stiffly at her side. He did not meet her gaze. Miss Marple, meanwhile, recalled an earlier incident, the orchard footprints that had vanished without explanation. She began to see threads tightening, the stranger who arrived with a claim of kinship, the missing guest, the blood in the snow, and now this letter, nearly lost to fire but not quite. Burnt paper, she reflected, was often more telling than words spoken aloud. People believed that fire destroyed, but it only half concealed. Just as snow could cover but not cleanse, fire too left its witnesses. She folded the fragment gently and slipped it into her knitting bag. "It is the little things that matter," she murmured softly. A teacup, a footprint, a half-burned word, they are the beginning of truth. Around her, the villagers shifted uneasily. For if truth had begun, it would not rest until it was fully revealed. Chapter 7. Suspicions and Snowstorms. The snow began its quiet descent in the late afternoon, soft at first, like sifted flour over the rooftops. By dusk, the flakes thickened into veils, wrapping the village in white silence. Paths disappeared, hedgerows bowed under heavy drifts, and lamps glowed faintly as though seen through frosted glass. By the time the church clock struck 6, the storm had become a prison, shutting doors and sealing roads. Only one refuge remained open, the manor house, where preparations for the Christmas feast had already begun. One by one, villagers arrived, cloaked and shivering, stamping the snow from their boots as the doors were opened to them. The great hall, with its high beams and garlands of holly, flickered with firelight, but no warmth could quite ease the unease that accompanied them. Outside, the storm howled across the chimneys, as though reminding everyone they were locked in, together, with no chance of escape until morning. Mrs. Hartley pressed her hands close to the blaze, murmuring that she had not seen a storm like this in years. Mr. Pritchard grumbled about supplies running low, while Mrs. Weatherby scolded the footmen for allowing wet footprints to mar the rugs. Every corner of the room held a cluster of voices, speaking in whispers that broke suddenly into nervous laughter when Miss Marple's calm eyes drifted their way. But tension laced through the company like a thread drawn too tight. The memory of blood by the church gate was not easily shaken, nor was the echo of that half-burnt letter, whose words still haunted those who had read them. The missing guest had become a shadow at every elbow, a presence felt more strongly for being absent. It was Mr. Abbot who raised his voice first, breaking the veneer of Christmas civility. "We must face it," he declared, setting down his glass with a thud. "Someone in this room knows more than they admit. Someone has lied." His gaze swept the company, lingering on faces that quickly turned away. Mrs. Hartley gave a sharp intake of breath, while Mrs. Weatherby clucked indignantly, demanding he hold his tongue on Christmas Eve. But the silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Even the crackle of the fire seemed subdued, as though the manor itself were listening. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, knitting in hand, the needles clicking softly. To the untrained eye, she seemed absorbed in the pattern of her wool. Yet her attention was fixed upon the flickers of expression across her neighbors' faces. The slight tightening of a jaw, the nervous tapping of a finger, the smile that did not reach the eyes. Each was a chapter in a story others were too flustered to read. The stranger who had arrived days earlier, the one claiming kinship, stood a little apart from the rest, leaning against the mantel. His presence cast a shadow over the gathering, his silence louder than words. Whispers swirled. Was he here for inheritance or something darker? Did he hold the key to the missing guest's fate, or was he merely another actor in a play of deceit? As the storm lashed harder against the manor walls, the sense of confinement grew. There would be no leaving, no slipping out unseen into the night. Every villager was now both witness and suspect, their secrets sealed in with them like so many locked doors. The air grew thick, not just with smoke and pine, but with unspoken fears. Miss Marple set down her knitting at last, her eyes lifting to the windows where snow pressed close against the glass. "A storm," she said softly, her voice carrying despite the hush, "often brings more to light than calm weather ever could." The villagers shifted, uneasy beneath her gaze. For in that room, warmed by fire yet chilled by suspicion, each of them knew, before the storm passed, truths long hidden might be forced into the open. The quarrel began with a whisper, as so many storms within walls often do. At first it was merely a sharp exchange between Mr. Pritchard and Mrs. Weatherby over some trifling matter of seating near the fire. He insisted that he had been there first, and she declared with great offence that a gentleman would never deny a lady the warmer spot. Voices rose, and soon their dispute turned from the present moment to long-standing grievances. "You've never forgiven me since the fete last summer," Mrs. Weatherby cried, her cheeks flushed red as the holly berries pinned to her shawl. "And why should I?" Mr. Pritchard retorted. "You undermined me in front of the whole committee. A man has his pride, madam, though you seem determined to trample it beneath your boots." The room, already tight with unease, seemed to shrink further as all eyes turned to them. A few gasps, a few murmurs, then silence as the quarrel took on a life of its own. Miss Hartley wrung her hands, begging for peace, but Mrs. Weatherby was beyond gentle persuasion. She accused Pritchard of stinginess, of dishonesty, even of cruel jealousy. He, in turn, shouted of her meddling tongue and her endless interference in others' affairs. But beneath their fiery words, a different truth glimmered. Mr. Pritchard, in his rage, let slip mention of "that night by the church gate," a phrase that drew startled looks from those nearby. Mrs. Weatherby blanched at the words, her mouth snapping shut as though she realized too late the depth of what he had implied. The quarrel might have escalated to blows had not the vicar stepped between them, his voice stern though quiet. "Enough," he said. "We are not children, nor enemies. This house is a refuge, not a battlefield. Whatever shadows hang over us, they will not be dispelled by anger." The fire crackled louder, as if punctuating his command, and yet the silence that followed was filled with more than mere awkwardness. In their heated exchange, the pair had revealed too much, hints of knowledge they ought not to have, an awareness of events better left unknown. Miss Marple, calm as ever, resumed her knitting. But her eyes had wandered to a corner of the room, where Mrs. Hartley bent down to gather a fallen handkerchief. Few noticed her movement amid the clamor of the quarrel, but Miss Marple did. The cloth, once white, bore a faint reddish mark at its edge, hastily folded to conceal the stain. The villagers remained caught up in the aftermath of the shouting match, muttering about tempers and propriety, while the more observant might have seen Miss Marple's gaze linger just a moment too long upon that handkerchief. A quiet clue, hidden by noise, was often the one that mattered most. The quarrel subsided at last, leaving behind an uneasy hush. Mr. Pritchard sulked by the fire, staring into the flames, while Mrs. Weatherby dabbed her eyes with lace, proclaiming herself ill-used. Neither won the argument, yet both had laid bare jealousies and fears they might have wished to hide. The others, though relieved the shouting had ended, could not forget what had been said in anger, nor what it suggested about the night's darker mystery. Outside, the snowstorm pressed harder against the manor walls. Inside, the quarrel's echoes lingered in every mind, a reminder that beneath smiles and carols, jealousy and fear waited only for the chance to break free. And in that fragile silence, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, marking time until the next revelation. Chapter 8. The Quiet Truth. The storm had gentled by morning, its fury spent, leaving the manor wrapped in a muffled calm. Pale light seeped through frosted panes, casting long shadows across the drawing-room where the villagers now gathered once more. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly, and the hush in the room felt more like a courtroom than a parlor. All eyes turned, almost without thought, to Miss Marple, who sat with her knitting folded neatly in her lap. She cleared her throat softly, her voice as even and unhurried as ever. "It seems to me," she began, "that we have all been so distracted by noise, by quarrels, by storms, by fears, that we have overlooked the quiet truths sitting before us." Her words, though gentle, held weight, and the villagers leaned closer without realizing it. "The blood by the church gate," she continued, "was not some stray accident. It belonged to the missing guest, the one who never arrived at the manor. The absence of footprints troubled me at first, but it was explained, quite neatly, once I remembered how snow falls in drifts, and how a man could be carried rather than walk." Gasps stirred at this suggestion, but Miss Marple did not falter. Her eyes, calm and keen, swept across the company. "The quarrel last night reminded me, our tempers reveal what our words try to hide. Mr. Pritchard spoke of that night by the church gate. How could he know of it unless he had seen it himself?" Mr. Pritchard bristled, but said nothing, his jaw set hard. "And Mrs. Weatherby's reaction," Miss Marple added softly, "was not that of surprise, but of fear. She knew, you see, that the missing guest had not simply vanished, but was very near indeed. The handkerchief she tried to conceal bore a telltale stain." The room shivered with murmurs, but Miss Marple lifted her hand, commanding quiet. "What puzzled many of you was the lack of a body. Yet it was there all along, hidden in plain sight. Not in the square, not in the churchyard, but nearer to hearth and home. Someone clever thought to disguise the truth, to bury it beneath ordinary domestic life, where few would look. But ordinary things, I find, often speak the loudest." She paused, letting her words sink in. The broken teacup, the cat with its shred of cloth, the letter burned but not entirely destroyed, each piece formed a thread. Pulled together, they reveal the tapestry. Our missing guest bled that night at the gate, and was carried away to be hidden. It was not the storm that concealed him, nor fate, but human hands, guided by fear and self-interest. The villagers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, for in her calm manner Miss Marple had exposed more than a crime. She had exposed the frailty of their trust. A hush deeper than snow filled the room, the weight of realization pressing upon every heart. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, her eyes kind though grave. Evil rarely announces itself with trumpets and drums. More often it slips in quietly, like frost at the window. And just so, truth comes quietly too, if only one has the patience to notice. In that moment, no one spoke, for they all felt the nearness of the truth, waiting to be named. The fire burned brighter now, logs crackling as though eager to banish the long night's shadows. The villagers gathered close, their breath held as Miss Marple's quiet voice spun the final strands of her explanation. No one dared interrupt, for they sensed the end was near, the unveiling of a truth too long veiled in silence and fear. "It was never chance," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes resting on Mrs. Weatherby. "The missing guest was your cousin, though you claimed he had not yet arrived. He came to press an old claim, to demand his portion of inheritance, and you, driven by resentment, by the memory of old quarrels and jealousies, sought to silence him." Mrs. Weatherby's hand flew to her throat, her lace collar quivering. "That is not true," she cried, but her voice trembled. Her protests rang hollow in the stillness. Miss Marple continued, gentle yet firm. "The blood at the church gate marked where he fell. You and Mr. Pritchard carried him away, fearful of scandal, fearful too of losing the comfort you had long enjoyed. You thought to hide the truth behind ordinary things, folded curtains, a closed-up cottage, a broken teacup hastily swept aside. But nothing remains hidden forever." Mr. Pritchard lowered his gaze, the defiance draining from his shoulders. Mrs. Weatherby sank into her chair, her bravado crumbling into weary silence. Around them, the others drew back slightly, not in cruelty but in quiet sorrow. The truth, at last, was undeniable. Yet Miss Marple's voice softened as she added, "Greed, jealousy, and pride, these are not new sins, nor confined to villains in books. They creep into even the most charming villages, weaving their way into ordinary hearts. But so too does forgiveness, if we let it." The vicar bowed his head, murmuring a prayer that seemed to ease the weight pressing upon the room. The villagers sighed, not in relief alone, but in a kind of release, as though a bitter frost had lifted from their hearts. By evening, the storm had passed. Smoke rose from chimneys once more, and children's laughter returned to the square, muffled by fresh snow underfoot. The church bells rang out, not with alarm but with Christmas cheer, their notes carrying across rooftops wrapped in frost. Inside the manor, tables were set again, this time not shadowed by suspicion but bright with candles and evergreen garlands. Platters of roasted meats, puddings, and steaming bowls of spiced punch were brought forth, and the villagers, subdued yet grateful, gathered to share what they had nearly lost. Miss Marple sat quietly among them, her knitting set aside for the evening. She accepted a cup of tea, the steam rising against her spectacles, and watched as laughter, tentative at first, then warmer, spread around the room. Peace, fragile but genuine, had returned. Yet she knew, as did a few others, that darkness had brushed the village close. The snow outside gleamed pure and white, but beneath it lay the memory of blood, a reminder that even the coziest corners hold secrets, and that evil does not dwell only in faraway places. It waits, sometimes, in the cottage next door, or in the heart of a neighbor one thought a friend. Still, Christmas had been restored. Candles glowed in windows, carols drifted softly in the night, and the village of St. Mary Mead, scarred yet healing, welcomed the season with gratitude. Miss Marple sipped her tea, a faint smile touching her lips. Justice had been done, but more than that, truth had found its way into the light. And for now, that was enough. And so, dear friends, the village of St. Mary Mead found its peace once more. The snow, once stained with fear, lay pure and glistening beneath the winter moon. Carols drifted through frosted lanes, children's laughter rang again in the square, and the warmth of Christmas returned to each hearth. The shadows of greed and jealousy had been revealed, and with them, harmony gently restored. Miss Marple, wise as ever, reminded us that even the quietest corners of the world can hold secrets, and that truth, though often hidden, brings light when uncovered. Thank you for joining me tonight in this tale. Tell me, what would you have done if you had been in St. Mary Mead on that snowy Christmas Eve? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed our evening together, do consider subscribing, so more mysteries may find their way to your fireside. Until next time, may your nights be warm, your tea comforting, and your heart ever curious.